Good morning, or depending on when you're watching this, good afternoon, good evening, or good night. My name's Ross, and as always told, out of Voice of Radio. So today, we're going to look at old rules. You see, back in the early days of the Pokemon trading card game, we had some weird rules, ladies and gentlemen. Now, these have been nicely collected on Jason Krasinski's blog. That's where I've gone to get a nice, neat list. But let me explain them all to you. Things used to be very, very different. So, first new rule. The coin flip happened after you had your active and your bench. You were not allowed to bench any extra Pokemon. You weren't allowed to switch your active. But the winner had to play first. And that's very, very different to how it is nowadays. Now, nowadays, you get a choice as to whether you play first or second. You still flip after setting up, but you don't have to go first. And this can be absolutely huge. I mean, we've talked about the new supporter rules recently, meaning that you're not able to either attack or play a supporter turn one going first. And for decks relying on stuff like Welder, going second can actually be really good now. Think about the Charizard and Reshiram deck, or Reshiram and Charizard deck, where you can just attach an Energy Welder and hit for 200 straight away. Or think of the Pikachu and Zekrom deck, that using Thunder Mountain Prism Star and Tapu Koko Prism Star could essentially use a full Blitz turn 1 for 180 and accelerate free energy. But there are other decks that really want to go first because maybe they're playing Zacian and V, and they want to use the ability that ends your turn, so you might as well use it when you're not able to attack anyway. Yeah, things used to be quite different, ladies and gentlemen. Speaking of the setup, the rule nowadays is that if one player does not have a basic Pokemon, because you've got to have a basic Pokemon to start the game, we call that a mulligan. Nowadays, you have one extra card that you're allowed to draw per mulligan, but you wait until your opponent has finished mulliganing, and then you announce how many you're going to take. It used to be that you got 2 cards per mulligan, and you decided if you were going to take 0, 1, or 2 after each mulligan. So your opponent mulliganed, you could take 0, 1, or 2 extra cards. And then if they mulliganed again, you had the choice again. Nowadays, your opponent has 2 mulligans, and you can take 0, 1, or 2 cards. They have 6 mulligans, you can take anywhere between 0 and 6 extra cards, but you've got to decide all at once after all of the mulligans. Now, in terms of retreating, things used to be very, very different. Because, you see, you used to be able to retreat as many times as you liked. The rule now is that you can only retreat once during your turn. Once you've retreated, you can't retreat anymore. This would be absolutely huge if this was a rule nowadays. And all we really need to look at is Jirachi and a skateboard. Because what you do is you put a Jirachi active, use the ability, look at the top 5 cards of your deck, find a trainer card, put it in your hand, Jirachi goes to sleep. But a skateboard lets you retreat for 1 less, so Jirachi for free, even if you're asleep. So you retreat to another Jirachi. And you can potentially use 2, 3, 4 Jirachi abilities in 1 turn. Now, we did actually used to do this with Smeargle, using Sky Arrow Bridge, which reduced the retreat cost of basic Pokemon by 1. But at least when we were doing it with Smeargle, we had to muck around with switches. We have to restrict retreating to once per turn. Otherwise, you would just have some Pokemon getting over the top broken. And speaking of retreating, being confused and retreating used to be very, very different. Now, the rule is that Pokemon that are confused have to flip a coin if they want to attack, and if they flip tails, they take 3 damage counters, and the attack fails and it goes to your opponent's turn. The rule used to be that if you tried to retreat, you had to flip a coin in order to retreat. And if you flipped tails, not only did your retreat fail, but you were not allowed to retreat again this turn. And here's a really harsh thing. You had to discard the energy necessary to retreat before you flipped. So if you flipped tails, not only were you not allowed to retreat, but you'd actually used the energy. You discarded it, and you'd failed to retreat, and then you weren't allowed to try again. So something like a Hitmonchan with a retreat cost of 2, you might use a double colourless energy to try and retreat it, but then if you flipped tails, you still lose the double colourless energy, you're just not allowed to retreat. But that wasn't the only difference with confusion back in the day. You see, it now is that you place 3 damage counters if you flip tails for confusion. But it used to be you did 20 damage, and yes, that applied weakness and resistance. So if we look at something like the movie promo Mewtwo, it is a psychic Pokemon that is weak to psychic. Which means that if the movie promo Mewtwo was confused and flipped tails when trying to attack, it would do 40 damage to itself, 20 normally, doubled for weakness. How harsh is that? The answer is very. Now, the other thing that was very, very different back then was stadium cards. Now, there were 2 major differences. You could play as many stadiums during your turn as you liked, and you could play one stadium to replace a stadium with the same name. Now, the rules nowadays are you can play one stadium per turn, but you cannot replace a stadium with the same name. And this would be huge. Now, let's take a stadium like Chaos Vortex, for instance, or Chaotic Swell, it was actually translated as over here. Chaotic Swell is the ultimate counter stadium. If you try and play a stadium to replace it, the new stadium gets discarded without doing anything. But if you were allowed to play multiple stadiums during your turn, well, you could just play another stadium right away. It would make Chaotic Swell significantly worse than it is nowadays. Yeah, that would be a big difference. Also, think of something like Lily. Lily draws until you've got 6 cards in your hand, so the smaller you can get your hand, the more cards you draw. And we've all been there in recent years where we can't play enough stadiums, so we can't draw enough cards. Where if we could have drawn one more card, we would have won, and we have a stadium in our hand we're not allowed to play. Or we're in a mirror match and our opponent plays a giant half down, and we're not allowed to play a giant half because there's already one on. Stadiums used to be very, very different. Now, there was one very, very small change that doesn't really matter. PLUSPOWER used to add 10 damage after applying weakness and resistance, not before, and it had to be attached to your active Pokemon. Now, we don't have PLUSPOWER at the moment, so it's not really a big one, but if we go back a little bit to say when we had Junk Arm, because PLUSPOWER got discarded, you could discard PLUSPOWER and then Junk Arm it and then play it again, and it did count weakness, so against a weak Pokemon it would be an extra 20. It used to be after weakness and resistance, so you wouldn't double up with weakness, and you attached it to the Pokemon, so it wasn't in your discard, so you couldn't reuse it with, well, it was Item Finder at the time. Not a big difference, but one that was back then, and you never know, we might get PLUSPOWER back one day. But the absolute biggest change back in the day was that the player going first could do whatever they liked. Now, I am going to do a video, hopefully later this week, looking at all of the history of the rules in this regard. It was requested on my Patreon, patreon.com/PTCGRadio, and that's what actually led me to going down the rabbit hole that led to this video. But right back in the early days, things were very different. You see, nowadays, we have a rule that you cannot attack on your first turn going first. We are getting a rule on February the 21st that you are not allowed to play a supporter card on your first turn if you go first. And we have supporter cards like Cynthia that are limited to 1 per turn. Not to mention the previously mentioned stadiums that, again, you can only play 1 per turn. And you could not play a stadium to replace the same stadium. None of this used to be the rules. On your first turn, if you went first, you could do anything you liked. Everything was just a trainer card. You could play as many as you wanted. You could retreat as often as you like, play as many stadiums as you like, and then you could end the turn by attacking. I showed you Erica's Jigglypuff the other day, and the general theory of that deck was you played stuff like Rocket's Trap and Rocket's Sneak Attack to just I'll link that video in the description, to just completely wreck your opponent's hand so they literally had a 0-card hand, and then you would attack with someone like Erica's Jigglypuff doing a fair amount of damage, and life would be good. For you, not your opponent. That's not possible anymore. You see, going first used to be a phenomenal advantage. It's not so much anymore. There are a lot of people arguing that the new rules mean that the player who goes first may end up passing with one Pokemon out, so the player going second could do something like use Welder to get a turn 1 KO on the only Pokemon. It's an interesting one. I'm going to have a chat with some people over in Japan, see how they're getting on with these new rules, because they've had them for a little while now, a couple of months, and I'll do a video kind of showing you my findings. But the point is, it used to be a redonkulous advantage to go first. And we did experiment with this very briefly at the beginning of the black and white era, where we had trainers and attacking turn 1 going first, and essentially what happened was that people just used Sableye and literally broke the game. Again, I did a video about that. I'll link it in the description. These were essentially your base set rules at the very beginning of the game, and though we might not care about the PLUSPOWER 1 anymore, if we had the rest of these rules, the Pokemon TCG would be a very, very different game indeed. So there we go. But I'd like to hear from you guys. Were you aware of these rules? Were you playing back then? And I think probably the more interesting question, would you like to have these rules nowadays? What do you think would happen if we had these rules in 2020? Go nuts in the comment section, but please do remember the rules. My rules, at least. Be nice, would you? And then make sure you like this video, subscribe to this channel, follow me on Twitter at TheWassy, and Twitch for some live action at twitch.tv/PTCGRadio. If you want to support the channel, get some bonus podcasts and all that, head on over to patreon.com/PTCGRadio, where you can do exactly that. And please do make sure you're checking out youtube.com/WassyPlays, where we talk about a whole bunch of games that don't have Pokemon in, but do have awesome. And by far the most important thing, as always, look after yourselves till next time, would ya? Thank you very much for watching. My name's Ross, and you've been watching PTCG Radio.